So this is the Gigabyte AERO 15 OLED. It's the flagship notebook within Gigabyte's AERO series, and they've made a few subtle design changes to make it somewhat distinguishable compared to last gen models, specifically the Classic series, which is still available, but this is like, they're trying to make this the more premium version of the AERO lineup. Now, I have the 4K OLED option, and I've been waiting to get my hands on this unit just because when I looked at it back at Computex, man, the display was just gorgeous. I really wanted to experience it for myself to see what it's like watching videos, but at the same time, for a creator like myself, can I actually take advantage of something like an OLED display for creating videos? So I have put it through its paces. I have some thoughts about it, so definitely stay tuned for that. But I also happen to have the exact same notebook with a 1080p 240Hz display. So I was really curious to compare battery life and see if you're actually gaining or losing anything switching to a 4K OLED screen. Now the 4K OLED models start at $1,700, and for that you get a 9th Gen Core i7 6-core processor, 8GB of RAM, a 256GB NVMe SSD, and a GTX 1660 Ti. The model that I have over here comes with a Core i9 9880HK 8-core 16-thread CPU, 16GB of RAM in dual channel mode, a 512GB NVMe drive, and an RTX 2070 Max-Q GPU. And it costs $3,000. Just let that sink in for a moment, because it's not cheap. It's expensive, but I'm glad that they're actually giving users the option to configure these notebooks to whatever they like, all the way up to 2080 Max-Q if you really want it that way. And so let's go through some of the changes, talk about the Core i9 performance, because this is my first laptop with the i9 CPU, 8-core 16 threads, that's awesome, and compared to the i7. But most importantly, I want to talk about that 4K display. Is it really worth the upgrade? So let's go through that, but first, a quick message from our sponsor.
AOC's warranty just respawned that covers 4 years general warranty for any defects, including a one-time accidental warranty replacement of AGUN monitors, because sometimes things happen, so you can enjoy a super smooth and responsive gameplay just like the warranty. Check it out below.
Alright, so there are a few subtle shifts from the previous generation in terms of design. The logo at the front says AERO instead of Gigabyte, and it's LED lit in white. Sorry RGB fans. The front panel now comes in this two-tone finish with these sharp-edged lines that give it a bit of an interesting character, but I still preferred the clean design from last year. They've redesigned the hinges on the newer models, but I'm not really a fan of it, guys. You see, they're way too small to support the whole display, and as you can see, there is a lot of wobbling going on over here. It's definitely a step back from last year's design, and I think they did this to expose the front vents for better airflow, plus they've added more vents on the sides, so we'll see how that plays out with thermals. Oh, and there's also another AERO branding right in the middle of the front vents, and there are LED lights pointing at it. You know what it reminds me of? This. I do want to take this time to apologize for something that I mentioned back in our hands-on video at Computex when we looked at the OLED notebooks. You see, we were told that these laptops would come with front-facing speakers, but that isn't the case. They're still located at the bottom, and so I'm not really sure what this front grille serves. It's certainly not for airflow. I wasn't able to feel any air as I was gaming, so don't fool yourselves thinking that that's a front-facing speaker. Now, sound quality is passable. It's not the best given the location of the speakers. The trebles are a bit too sharp. Bass is just non-existent, so I'd highly recommend getting a pair of headphones if you decide to watch movies. Now the nose cam has been shifted from the display all the way to the frame right above the power button, which makes it the worst possible location to have a camera. It's stationary, which means you can't move it, so it's literally going to point at your fingers, and the quality is pretty terrible. It's right beside the microphone too, which means if you're gaming on it and using the camera, it's a complete fail from Gigabyte if you were to ask me. I just wish if they relocated that at the top to make it somewhat appealing, but it's a fail. The keyboard layout still remains the same with perky RGB lighting with a few handful of lighting effects. However, the keys felt a bit mushy compared to last gen. The travel distance also feels a bit shorter as well, but it's still pretty good. Better than my Razer Blade 15 for sure, but I still think Lenovo Legion laptops have the best overall keyboard in the business. The trackpad hasn't changed. It still comes with Windows Precision drivers, although it's not as smooth or as precise as my Razer Blade 15. The good thing is that it does come with a built-in fingerprint reader, so that's a secure way to log into your PC. Highly appreciate that. As for ports, they've shuffled the layout this time, but they haven't cut any corners. So on the right hand side, you have your power in, full-size UHS 2.0 card reader, Thunderbolt 3 Type-C, 2 USB 3.1 Gen 1, which is disappointing because you're only limited to 5 gigabits per second versus 10 gigabits per second with Gen 2. Switching over to the left, we have HDMI 2.0, USB 3.1 Type-C that also functions as DisplayPort 1.4, another 3.1 Type-A, a headphone/mic jack, and an RJ45 port. All right, so let's talk about that 4K OLED display. It's one of the best looking screens that I've encountered on a notebook, guys. It's sharp, very bright, so yes, you can take it outdoors, but keep in mind that it is glossy, so it gets reflective depending on how you position the screen, and the colors are breathtaking. The display is factory calibrated by X-Rite, and it covers 100% of the DCI-P3 color gamut, so it's beautiful to watch movies. You get a nice high contrast look with deeper blacks, which means there's absolutely no signs of backlit bleed given the nature of the panel, and for content creators, this is like a dream come true. But is it really worth upgrading from a 1080p high refresh rate IPS display? And the answer to that really depends on how you decide to use your notebook. You see, if you're primarily a gamer, skip the 4K option, just go for the 1080p display because the high refresh rate is just the way to go. It's fast, it's fluid. You can't go back to a 4K panel with 60 hertz. It's really limiting, especially when gaming. Plus, you can't really game at 4K given the hardware. The RTX 2070 still struggles at 4K, so keep that in mind. But if your primary use case is creating videos, photos, or graphics, you're gonna have a blast with this 4K option because having spent time with Premiere, going through the timeline and editing videos just for test purposes, and of course watching videos, I couldn't take my eyes off of this display. It's just that good. The colors are vibrant. Everything about it is just so well done, and I don't really have anything to complain about it. I particularly enjoyed the deeper blacks on this display. That's the one thing that I really appreciated about this OLED panel, but it's also the colors too. It's just, you just sit in front of it and you get to experience it. That being said, I have a few issues. So when I plug in external USB devices, if it's like a hard drive or a wireless receiver for my wireless mouse, I noticed that the screen flickers for like 2 seconds and it goes back to normal. So that was a little bit odd, but I also did notice some flickering issues just once in a while as I was browsing through the web and just doing my testing. So that is unfortunate. I'm not sure if it's just my sample, but something to certainly keep note of. Now for display scaling, I didn't really experience any issues with the apps that I use on a regular basis. Out of the box, this notebook comes set to 250%, but I really recommend setting it to 200% for the best viewable experience. You could set it to 100% for a 1-to-1 ratio, but then you would need a magnifying glass to navigate around the screen. Honestly, 4K on a 15-inch notebook, it is a debatable topic, but it's about the experience of using one in the first place. That's ultimately what it comes down to. And I really enjoyed my time using this OLED display. But with all of that being said, we have to address the elephant in the room, and that is burn-in. I reached out to Gigabyte asking them about what measures they have taken to address this issue. And they did mention that they've put these panels through some rigorous testing to ensure that that doesn't happen, but it's not a 100% guarantee. So I guess we're just gonna have to wait and see how this panel plays out over long term. So yeah, it is what it is. Upgrading this notebook is pretty straightforward. Once you open up the bottom cover, you have instant access to the 2 RAM modules, which can easily be upgraded up to 64 gigabytes. And then you have the pre-installed M.2 drive, which doesn't have the fastest write speed compared to some of the other notebooks that I've taken a look at the past. You have an additional M.2 slot for expansion. I do want to mention that the killer Wi-Fi card on this notebook was absolutely terrible. I had the worst experience browsing through the web and of course playing multiplayer games. The Wi-Fi would just drop all of a sudden. The whole thing would just disconnect me, which was really, really frustrating. I don't know why Gigabyte is sticking with killer Wi-Fi networking cards, so it just ruins the whole gaming and I guess browsing experience, if you want to put it that way. Now, both AERO notebooks feature the same size battery, so 94 watt hours. I ran my standard light load test refreshing a Chrome web page on both the 4K OLED and the 1080p 240Hz display, And as you can see, the OLED ran about 46 minutes shorter compared to the 1080p model, and I expected that because it is a 4K display after all, and the power draw completely depends on what's on the screen since every pixel is individually lit. Plus, this model is running an i9 CPU versus the i7, so that's another factor to consider. The same story goes for the heavy load test running Realbench on a loop. And finally, taking a look at performance, the Core i9 8-core 16-thread CPU is really fast. However, it's nothing significant compared to the Core i7 9750H 6-core processor. As you can see, the Omen X2S that I checked out recently is not too far behind in both multi-core and single-core tests. But man, that blender time is crazy though. Interestingly enough, the AERO 15 notebook featuring the Core i7 CPU didn't do that great compared to the Omen, but that's because Gigabyte doesn't unlock the full potential of that CPU. It gives you a balanced experience without affecting thermals that much. Remember, the Omen ran really hot during my testing. Taking a look at our 12-minute Premiere Pro test, I was really surprised at how well the i7 and the i9 performed. But I have an explanation for that. You see, as I was monitoring clock speeds, I noticed that the Core i9 CPU averaged between 3.1 and 3.4 GHz on all 8 cores while rendering the video versus 3.7 GHz and a little over that on the Core i7 model. So the higher frequency did come in clutch to close the gap between the two. So that's something to definitely keep note of, especially if you plan on, if you're debating between the Core i7 and the Core i9, you're not going to notice a huge difference between the two in terms of pure rendering performance. Gaming, on the other hand, was good. Like I said earlier, I wouldn't recommend picking up the 4K model for it, but if you are comfortable with 60 Hz, you can certainly get away with over 100 frames per second in 1080p set to the highest settings. I was curious to see if the i9 made any difference, and as you can see, the improvements were very minimal. Taking a look at temperatures, the Core i9 did peak at 95°C, but as soon as I hit that point, it shifted the clock speeds to bring those temps down to an average above 85°C. For casual tasks, the CPU was able to maintain above 4 GHz and the temperatures were under control. The RTX 2070 Max-Q ran cooler than last year's model as the core temps peaked at 76°C and the clock speeds were shifting back and forth between 1300 and 1410 MHz, which does align with NVIDIA's spec sheet. Fan noise is certainly not the biggest forte of the AERO 15 notebook. It certainly gets loud under heavy load scenarios, especially if you're gaming or if you're editing videos, because it's trying really hard to cool that Core i9 processor and the RTX 2070 Max-Q GPU. So I would highly recommend pairing this with a pair of headphones just so you can isolate yourself from all the noise.
The new Hydro X series from Corsair is a full water cooling ecosystem with transparent blocks for RGB goodness and built-in flow indicators, with soft and hard tubing available and a full array of fittings so you can design the perfect loop for you. Hydro X by Corsair. Everything's linked below.
So this brings us to the conclusion. And guys, I gotta admit, I am not really happy with what Gigabyte has done here with the newer AERO 15 models because, for one, the redesign of the hinges is just bad. I mean, it's small. I don't know how far or how long it can support this display because it gets super wobbly, so it's certainly something to consider. The nose cam is located at the worst possible location. It's just not ideal. A complete fail if you were to ask me. The speakers are still located at the bottom. Wish they were front-facing. The I/O is also not up to spec, which is really odd, especially since you're paying almost $3 grand for a notebook. I mean, USB 3.1 Gen 1 is pretty limiting, especially if you're looking for a notebook with the highest spec. It's just kind of limiting, but it comes with a full-size SD card slot, so I guess that's a bonus. They played it safe this time with the thermals on the Core i9. They didn't push it too extreme, so it's respectable, but it's not something that I would worth or consider upgrading from the Core i7 models because the performance difference is really not that significant. Not to mention, Wi-Fi performance on both these notebooks were pretty terrible, and that's of course due to the killer networking cards. Intel seems to have the best in the business right now. I'm not sure why Gigabyte decided to go with killer in the first place. And finally, there's a question of whether or not if you should go with the 4K OLED display or the 1080p 240Hz display. Honestly, I think I'm gonna stick with the 1080p panel because I love the fluidity and the responsive and the refresh rate in general of the screen. It's still a very color accurate display. I can comfortably edit videos on it. I don't think you'd go wrong with a 1080p panel in the first place. And the biggest limiting factor for me with a 4K display is the refresh rate. At 60 Hz, it is a bit limiting, especially coming from a high refresh rate screen. But the colors on this, the contrast ratio on this is really, really nice. Better than the IPS screen, of course. But I think it's safer to go with this display because I don't have to worry about potential burn-in issues on the 4K options. So let's wait and see how OLED matures over time. Potentially we could get lower resolution, high refresh rate OLED panels with better durability over time too. So let me know what you guys think about the Aero 15 from Gigabyte, specifically the OLED models. Would you consider one right now? And let me know your thoughts about the Core i9 performance. Were you surprised by that? Love to know your thoughts. I'm Ebro with Canucks. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to check out some relevant content over here. Also subscribe and hit that notification button every time when we pump out a new video. I'm signing off, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.